So, Dr. Maggette emailed me and asked me to make this video for the class he's teaching, which some of you are currently taking. For clarification, for anyone watching this who isn't an Oklahoma State student in his Spring 21 honors class, Dr. Maggette was one of my former research advisors during my undergraduate degree. I worked in his lab for over 2 years, and my first peer-reviewed publication that I was ever co-author on was work done in his lab with some other former students in his group. But I'll get back to that later. He asked me to make a video about the impact of the research I've done and research in general as an undergraduate has had on me in my life thus far, and I'll try to do that now. Okay. So, growing up, I had one goal in mind, and it was to be Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter. I'm sure you're familiar. That was my goal. In the many elementary schools I went to, as my family moved around from Nigeria to Pennsylvania to Texas, I decimated the nonfiction sections of every library. Well, to be super precise, I decimated the animal section of all of their libraries. Those picture books that kids would read that would highlight some interesting animal that was maybe Komodo dragons or two-toed sloths or the peregrine falcon. Occasionally you would see me dabble in reading about planets and stars. More on that soon. But generally I focused on animals. And that's kind of the most interesting thing to me during my time as a young kid. The thing that made me most excited was animals. Funnily enough, I refused and wasn't capable of reading chapter books, so I was actually placed in remedial English class sometime in third grade. Within a year or so, I was then placed in the gifted program, so obviously I was a strange student and I don't know, not the prototypical gifted student either. I'm not sure a 9-year-old can be enigmatic, but my clouded memories of those years suggest that I was super enigmatic. Earlier I mentioned an interest in space. For some nonfiction books and a few sci-fi novels I read in middle school, I also developed a keen interest for astronomy. And this was just a general desire, what's out there, what's in space, what are the stars, what are they made of, that sort of thing. Fast forward to high school, and at this point I'm realizing that being the next Steve Irwin isn't a viable career path, which turns out it actually is. Or so I saw the last time I was on social media, but probably wouldn't have been for me. I was also definitely not a star student or a gifted student at this point. I got my first C in Algebra 2. I couldn't become an astronomer anymore because I wasn't particularly good at math, or at least I thought that in my own eyes. I didn't really know what I was going to do in life. My main interest was comedy. I love comedy. I religiously watched stand-up, sketch comedy, any kind of comedy, TV shows. Anything that could evoke laughter, I loved it. I was into it, and I was maybe I could make a career out of this, but I had no idea how to do that. I was also a good track and field athlete. I had that going for me, but I never really wanted to be a pro athlete, even when I was performing at my best, and that was, possibly in the future. Honestly, I was unmotivated almost the entirety of high school. So I remember the few classes that excited me. One of them was an environmental science class. My teacher, who I hope watches this someday, got me super excited about studying the environment and at its many different scales. I became aware of the sorts of science that thinks about both life and the world and the ways in which they interact. I learned how crazy environmental catastrophes happened and the amazing success stories of rehabilitation. This class alone made me become an environmental science major in college. That's the whole reason why I have that degree, or at least the whole reason I began that degree. How I got to Oklahoma State is a long story that centers around me not really having any motivation to search out a college situation that I could have a major I liked, continue my track career, and afford the tuition. The story is super long and super complicated. But let's just say by the time I applied to Oklahoma State, people were already going for summer orientation. I was not on top of things. Okay, so I spent a lot of time in my youth thinking about animals, and I say all of that, like all the things about my youth, to say that I tried research just because I'd read a few scientific research articles in one class. I had no true idea of what research was, and there was no real understanding on my part of what it meant to be a researcher. So we're here now. Research at Oklahoma State University. What did I do? How did I get into it? The second semester of my freshman year, I emailed a soil microbiologist and began like my first foray into research. I didn't know what I was doing, obviously, and she didn't really have the money for me to work on a real project, but she showed me a lot about the life of a scientist, and honestly, for that, I'm forever indebted. I mostly read papers and analyzed data about a topic that I thought was interesting. In the moment, I was frustrated a lot and it was really difficult, but I learned so much, so much from that experience. During that time, I applied for summer research jobs and got rejected from pretty much all of them, except one, and that's all you need. I got a job working as a technician in a government mosquito biocontrol lab. Basically, I fed and cleaned up after mosquitoes for an entire summer. I don't know. Doesn't sound like an ideal job to most people, and it wasn't really to me either. But the ideas were interesting. Essentially, there are these native mosquitoes in the area that I was working in. They grew up eating the mosquitoes that bother us, and that's how they get their nutrients. So they don't need human blood. And some clever people thought, can we use these mosquitoes to kill the mosquitoes that bother us and transmit diseases? I just did my part working in that lab for the summer, but that was cool to me. I thought it was cool that people could think about the world that way and try to make it better for humans. And it wasn't exactly the perfect fit for me, but I thought it was cool. So I came back to Oklahoma State that fall, and I began working with Dr. Mungeti in a molecular ecotoxicology lab. Obviously completely left field from soil microbiology and definitely mosquitoes. But I wanted to try anything and everything just to try to figure out what I liked. The things I did in Dr. Mungeti's lab were focused. It was focused on trying to understand this mechanistic effect of toxicology that I'll get into later. But I'll say that this was my first real research project. I worked on developing a method, and I tried to make these measurements for several years, and it culminated in my work. Like, that's a part of a paper. It's the first paper I ever had. So I'll talk about this more in just a second, but I wanted to emphasize that even after I got into his lab, I kept trying different things. I went, the next summer I worked at a fire ant ecology lab at an undergraduate research experience program at the University of Texas. I studied the response of fire ants to fungal infections using genetics and basically Darwin-style pen and paper observations. I was just writing down what I watched ants do. The fall of my junior year, I started working with Dr. Ashley Burkett in the invertebrate paleontology lab, trying out research in the broad field of geobiology, the field that I'm now in as a graduate student at Caltech. In that lab, I studied foraminifera that live at the bottom of the ocean, and I tried to understand how and why they live the way they live. It was part of discovering a new species that's just still a crazy thing to me, that I discovered a new organism during undergrad. Like, that's something that I was a part of, and that's crazy. This work isn't published yet, though, so allow me for a moment to sort of explain the only scientific work that I've done which has been immortalized in the grand form of the PDF. This work, which according to Science Direct has been read by a grand total of 17 people, and not to undermine it, but a side note to researchers whose hubris has gotten the better of them. Yes, on one hand, scientific research is the way by which we change the world and progress humanity and all that beautiful and wonderful stuff that you can pontificate about for hours. But on the other hand, all we really do is write things and then put them in places where almost no one will ever read them. So, yeah. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but humility is a virtue. I'll leave it at that. So, on to the research. When I worked in Dr. Mungeti's lab, I tried to understand the effects of metal pollutants on aquatic organisms. Well, we can be more clear than that, right? I tried to quantify the secondary toxicity associated with the proliferation of reactive oxygen species in rainbow trout liver and gut cells caused by primary metal toxicity. A mouthful, complex, yes, but we can break that down really easy. I grew cells, I put them on plates, I put toxic metals in some of those plates. I let the cells live with these toxic metals for some amount of time. I then used a fluorescent dye that glowed when it interacted with oxygen to measure how many reactive oxygen species were present in these metal toxified cells compared to normal cells. To cut the punchline of many dozens of experiments and many years of my life, exposing these cells to metals had no real effect on the amount of reactive oxygen species inside the cells. So years of work for nothing, right? No, I don't think so. Like, I did a similar experiment, but instead measured the size of the cell's nuclei. This data showed us that the cells were definitely dying, which we already knew. You could look at them under a microscope, but we're scientists, so we quantify things. Add that to the work done by other people in the lab to observe the accumulation of the metals within the cells and the expression of the specific enzymes following metal exposure, and you can begin to tell a story about how the cells are responding to toxic metals. And because these cells are the primary cells in a fish that respond to the metals in water, you can make some inferences about how the fishes will respond to pollutants. Now we know something more about the life around us and how it responds to human perturbations. And that's what's cool to me. That's why I do science. And that's what makes all of this worth it. The difficult parts of it worth it. And more than worth it. I do it willingly. I choose to do it. It's a great job, and I think that it's a valuable thing if you're interested in science. I don't need to go off and have a soliloquy about how great science is and how amazing it is. And there's many soliloquies about all the ways it's not. But yeah, that's my story about how my undergraduate research experience changed my life. Somehow I'm here doing a PhD, and it's all because of mosquitoes and soil and fish cells and weird things that live at the bottom of the ocean.